first exhibition, so I'm so excited and pleased to be surrounded by everybody's amazing and inspiring work.
Always been very drawn to fabrics. I was brought up by a household where women used fabrics and embroidered and sewed and made clothes and things. But I wanted to find a way to express my artistic work rather than just by simple painting and drawing.
Inspired hugely by a beautiful building called the Cloud Building. It's a conceptual building, it's never been seen before, but I took that as my starting process and I started to monoprint and then started to sew. It ended up looking a bit like a map. I'm looking at a sort of overview of a map, so I called my piece Grid Map, strangely so true, and no, it just went from there.
I got a set of postcards from my grandmother when I was a child. She gave me them, and they came from my great-grandfather during the First World War. He sent these embroidered postcards back from the trenches in the First World War. When I was a child, it was a big treat to get to see this album of postcards. I went to go visit her. My most precious object. And I always wanted to do a piece that's sort of related to that. So it's a postcard that came from the war, involved embroidery.
I started out in the 1980s making work out of things that weren't meant to be made into things. This has kind of extended into using all sorts of recycled and waste materials, remnants left over from t-shirt manufacture. So it's like the strips down the side of a big length of fabric and they just chuck it away.
It was to do with trying to see how felt could become more three-dimensional. It's a flat piece, but when it's attached to driftwood like it is, it starts to throw shadows against the wall, which is what I really enjoyed. And from then on, it just grew.
Had an interest in masks and made-up creatures and puppets and things coming to life ever since I was a kid. And when I realised that felt was a three-dimensional craft as well as two-dimensional, for some reason one day I just thought I'll try making a mask. And they've just turned into creatures along the way. So it's just exploring wherever my slightly warped imagination goes next.
It's been looking at beauty and how the body is presented in society, how people get comfortable into what they can see in life, and how when someone is distorted they get a bit funny about it. And this was to show something that becomes to life, and you expect something that's really pretty coming out of a flower or a bird, and actually what comes out of it is not pretty to look at, it's more distorted and deformed, so people get challenged into, is it actually beautiful even if it's coming to life?
In the summer of 2009, I was back in Nebraska visiting my family. Sometime in the 1860s, they'd moved to the States. Very different from England, where I was living at the time. And knowing the vast contrast between the two countries, I wanted to know why they had moved from England to the States. And that question was what started this whole project.
I wanted to create almost like a family tree that doesn't have any visual representation of the people. I wanted it to be a very abstract, almost emotional kind of story about the people. And each one has a very different character, and I hope that it kind of makes people think about who they were and maybe makes them think about the people that were in their family that are no longer with them but still have an impact on their lives and still inspire them in strange ways.
Inspired by a novel that I read in the last year of college, because we've always lived in the castle, and I decided to take a few themes from the book that meant a lot to me, like youthful optimism and obsession. So I just worked around those themes. Work's really about illustration, and that's my passion. So each piece is like highly detailed, and it takes quite a while to produce. But I love adding like a tedious amount of detail into each piece.
To me, it was a very strange journey doing these, because a lot of these people haven't been in my life for over 10 years. It was quite an emotional journey to think back on who they were and to recreate those emotions. It was a very nice thing to do. I really enjoyed it.
The first piece I made about this was because of the invasion of Iraq, which I felt was very wrong, and I think a lot of people felt was very wrong. And I sewed together all the newspaper cuttings I was saving, and then I distressed them.
My other piece is called Embellish. It was basically a happy accident, I'd like to call it, because I started doing Nuno felting and it wouldn't work. My felting, I'm rubbing, hand felting, and it just wouldn't go together. So I decided to cheat and use an embellisher machine, which is like 10 needles, and it punches through, and it will stick anything together.
Fully, it conveys sort of anti-war sentiment, at the same time a sense of humour and fun. I sort of found the work through the making. First of all, hand embroidering the tanks, found swatches of material and lined them up with the flowers to make little explosions. That came through the making type thing. We always had the concept of doing a whole lot of them, so it looks like a large battalion, so you have sort of feeling of quantity within the work.
Some of this work has been like knitting tubes and so on, is fed into making smaller scale pieces that are actually quite wearable. This one that we're standing next to is purely experimental. It was the first thing I made when the yarn arrived from the suppliers, and I thought, right, how many stitches can I get onto that? So I basically cast on, knitted 4 rows and cast off. I thought that would make a scarf.
They are where my imagination gets let off the hook. They have their own personalities. I think that's how my mind works, that the world is invested with personalities, whether I like it or not.
I think that they reflect an interest that I had as a child in fantasy, legends. I was particularly interested in King Arthur and Merlin and so on. And if you look at them, I hope that you can see the sort of the clothes that they would have worn at the time. And this one over here, for example, I call Crusade. Makes me think of perhaps they would have worn into battle.
It's nice to see the different reaction towards it, because it's a piece that's made for people to react to. But I'm making a piece which it's actually going to be part of a performance, so it's really going to become alive, like you can see on the pictures.
With this project, because it's about family history, there's loads of people interested in their own family history. And when I was showing this in the cemetery in Exeter, I got into lots of conversations with people that had been tracing their own history, and so it really connected with them as well, and they wanted to share their stories.
This is my first exhibition, so I found it a very strange process. In a way, you're very vulnerable, but at the same time, it's very open because you're allowing people to, you're putting yourself out there to be judged.
It's great to see my work on display again, and it's good to get some feedback from everyone. As it's been really positive, and it's great to see it in the context of like a wider range of textiles as well.
And having lots of people coming to have a look at it and to see how they just want to touch it, and then like, am I allowed to touch it?
It gives you a target. So you think, right, I'm going to make work for this particular exhibition and I need to have a coherent body of work. And that's very important sometimes, because otherwise you can spend all your time in the studio just fiddling about.
You're doing artwork, you're experimenting and you're thinking about new ideas. And it's quite hard to resolve them sometimes, but the exhibition is always good to close things off and resolve them. Displaying them is always important as well, how you display one piece next to the other. And yeah, it's part of the work itself. It's always, you're not just quite sure what other people think of it.
Right, and there's nobody's anything's quite like mine. So the originality is a great sort of uniqueness, but also I feel like I need to push forward and do, my pieces were experimental, so it isn't actually, they're not finished pieces. I'm learning all the time and I'm creating more new works every day.
It was really interesting working with Curio because I didn't have time to produce new work for this exhibition. So they came and looked at all my fiddling about and pulled out a coherent body of work from it for me, which was also very good.
Introducing people to different type of artwork is quite good to reach a wider audience. This work I've shown in a cemetery in Exeter, on the front lawn of my parents' home in Nebraska. It's important to make sure that you're showing people that might not usually go into galleries. You know, art is for everybody, and I think making it accessible is good.
It's always interesting to have new people seeing what you do, and I think particularly with textiles and with felting, there is a certain perception of what felting is. Very often it's jesters' hats and slippers, so it's very nice for people to be able to see that it's got a more artistic side to it.